It's full-on panic in China. President Xi Jinping has just watched the military he spent decades building receive the most brutal wake-up call imaginable. She never saw this coming. When the U.S. began bombing Iran, he likely thought China was safely out of reach. But what she has witnessed has utterly terrified him, for it communicates one stark truth to the Chinese president. China isn't ready. It's not ready for the sheer military might the U.S. has just unequivocally proven it can unleash. This realization will undoubtedly send shivers down Xi's spine, especially as analysts believe he'll be ready to launch his invasion of Taiwan by 2027. But China is also woefully unprepared for the geopolitical firestorm it would face if it ever dared to go to war with the U.S. We'll delve into the geopolitical ramifications later in this video. But on the military front, the U.S.'s recent brief war with Iran has unveiled several stark realities that will leave Xi quaking in his boots. First and foremost, the U.S. has proven its unparalleled ability to blind an entire nation before launching its attacks. That's precisely what happened in Iran. As intelligence analyst and cybersecurity expert Ryan McBeath reveals in a YouTube video, the U.S. masterfully coordinated air, space, and cyber actions designed to censor networks and disrupt command and control systems. This left Iran severely hampered in its ability to see, coordinate, and respond. Missy BTH explains that the initial hours of the joint U.S. and Israeli strikes in Iran weren't characterized by bombs and missiles falling, but rather by a synchronized effort to shut down Iran's systems, drastically increasing the chances of the U.S. finding its targets with minimal Iranian resistance. Lawfare Media reports that these sophisticated cyber operations were crucial to the swift early elimination of Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei. They allowed the U.S. and Israel to pinpoint exactly when Khamenei would be meeting with key senior officials, providing the perfect window for precision strikes. Other cyber and intelligence operations ensured that a massive portion of Iran's air defense network was neutralized before a single U.S. bomber or fighter jet even entered the arena. By the time Iran could even contemplate a response, thousands of targets had already been obliterated, and the nation was unequivocally on the back foot. We'll return to the sheer scale of America's attack in a minute. But by effectively shutting down Iran's eyes and ears, the U.S. delivered a chilling preview to China of exactly what it would do in the event of a war between the two powers. This capability isn't just about enhancing the power and scale of U.S. strikes. It also poses a profound problem for any potential counter-responses. If you're a crew on an anti-H-ship missile team and nobody's on the other end of the phone telling you to fire and where to fire, you're not going to fire, McBTH emphasizes. And that's precisely the critical lesson from the U.S.'s actions in Iran that she must take to heart. You can painstakingly build one of the strongest arsenals of missiles, as China is widely believed to have done. On the intercontinental ballistic missile front alone, Newsweek states that China possesses 550 launchers and approximately 400 missiles. But none of that truly matters if your command and control systems are so effectively neutralized that operators at these sites and China's many other launch facilities cannot communicate with military leadership. This is dire news for Xi confrontation with the U.S. It becomes even more catastrophic when you introduce Taiwan, Xi's most probable target, into the equation. As McBeath clarifies, China's plan for Taiwan is less about landing soldiers on beaches, though that would certainly be attempted. The primary strategy involves saturating Taiwan with missile bombardments, and for that to succeed, command and control must be flawlessly operational. The U.S. proved in Iran that it can completely such systems before even launching an attack. This is a brutal wake-up call for Xi. Now, we just mentioned targets, which brings us to the second critical issue she faces after witnessing the U.S. in Iran. Sherjaka, with Iran's eyes and ears incapacitated, the U.S. simply overwhelmed the nation's entire military infrastructure. The U.S. demonstrated an unprecedented ability to scale up day one strikes to such a massive extent that they hit around 1,000 targets right off the bat. After nearly a week of conflict, Breaking Defense reported that the U.S. had conducted over 3,000 strikes against Iran, hitting 43 of its ships in the process. Beyond the command and control centers we've already highlighted, the U.S. systematically pounded Iranian drone and missile manufacturing and launch sites to the point where, according to some sources, Iran's drone launches have plummeted by 83%. And its ballistic missile attacks are down a staggering 90% compared to Iran's initial attempts to respond. This sheer scale sends an undeniable message to anyone who might consider crossing the U.S. in the future. America strikes on a scale nobody thought possible. Instead of a hurricane followed by a tidal wave like an Operation Desert Storm, we give the adversary 1,000 tornadoes on the first night, is how Mick Beath vividly categorizes it. And he's absolutely right. The U.S. has showcased its unparalleled ability to coordinate its jets and bombers with its space, cyber, and naval divisions, a display of combat-tested capabilities that China simply does not possess. She may harbor illusions that China could replicate something similar, but China's enormous military has not been truly tested in the modern era. The U.S. has unequivocally proven what it can do in Iran, and that means she now understands that the U.S. could unleash the same devastation on China if he's foolish enough to launch a Taiwan invasion that draws American involvement. There's much more to cover as we continue through this video. Next on the list are America's long-range stealth capabilities. Although the U.S. is now employing a sledgehammer approach, shattering Iran with its older non-stealth bombers, the initial hours of the war saw the deployment of its formidable B-2 Spirit stealth bombers. These bombers executed surgical strikes directly under the collective nose of Iran's air defenses, which is impressive enough. However, it's the sheer range of this stealth assault that will have truly captured Xi's attention. American V-52 bombers completed remarkable 37-hour round-trip flights from the continental U.S. to Iran, carrying out precision strikes against several Iranian facilities during the campaign's opening hours. Their ability to remain airborne for such extended periods was thanks to the U.S. having a vast fleet of aerial refueling tankers. Think about what this signifies for Xi. He now knows that U.S. pilots are trained to such an elite level that they can fly for roughly a day and a half without stopping, still execute their strikes flawlessly, and then return home. The concept of China being out of range simply doesn't apply here. If the U.S. decides to bomb China, as it might in the event of a Taiwan invasion, there's virtually nothing China can do to counter the B-2s other than desperately hoping its air defenses, which would already be compromised by the U.S. strategy of blinding China's eyes and ears, could somehow engage them. Does China possess a similar capability? It might have the H-20. That's a stealth bomber designed to rival the best the U.S. has to offer. But Aerospace Global News reports the bomber effectively dropped off the radar, figuratively speaking, in 2025, and it will be at least a few more years before it can pose any credible threat to the U.S. And even if it were available today, we return to our earlier point. The U.S. just demonstrated what its stealth bombers can do in Iran. Chinese capability, by contrast, remains largely theoretical. So she must grapple with the fact that he knows the U.S. possesses long-range stealth, but he cannot be truly certain that China can match the U.S. in that crucial department, and somehow it gets even worse for Xi. So far, we've focused on how the U.S. has repeatedly proven its military prowess, hitting thousands of targets in days, deploying long-range stealth and shattering an opponent's eyes and ears. However, there's a far more existential threat that is presented to Xi by what the U.S. has done in Iran. Something we briefly touched on earlier. Ali Ka is dead. That single fact fundamentally reshapes how she must approach any war that could potentially provoke U.S. involvement. And by the way, there's a lot more where this came from. So if you're finding value in the military show, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. What the U.S. has shown Xi in Iran is its willingness to target a country's senior leadership from the very moment a conflict arises. MacBTH explains, stating the initial wave was synchronized with an Israeli strike at Iran's supreme leader. The critical takeaway here is that if U.S. intelligence decides it wants to help an ally find something extremely well protected, it can at least sometimes. This raises deeply unsettling questions for Xi. Can China truly protect its senior leadership? Iran, despite its vast network of underground bunkers designed for that very purpose, could not. China may have similar facilities, but she now knows the U.S. and Israel can still hit them. All it takes is for the U.S. to learn about one meeting, one fleeting moment of exposure, and then it's over. She would be out of the picture, and he knows it. But it gets even worse for China's president. The U.S. and Israel have demonstrated that they're not stopping at the very top of the food chain. Political and military leaders across Iran have been systematically eliminated in widespread airstrikes targeting the country. This means she cannot even rely on others to continue his work if the U.S. comes calling with missiles and bombs. As Sky News reports, Israel claims that approximately 40 of Iran's top military commanders were taken out during the initial wave of strikes alongside the U.S. Right now, Iran has already selected a new supreme leader. After a brief interim period with a three-person council, the Assembly of Experts swiftly appointed Mojaba, the son of the late Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. That simply means the Assembly of Experts now has a big jar of paint and a brush ready to paint a target onto somebody else's back. If she were to fall to similar strikes, would anyone in China even want the job while the U.S. is on the attack? What she is witnessing in Iran is a coordinated effort to decapitate an entire country's regime. And it's working for Xi. The timing couldn't be worse because he has been systematically dismantling the top of China's military structure for some time now. On March 3rd, the BBC reported that China had removed 3 experienced military generals, Gao Wei, Lula, and Hanegua, from a top political advisory board. Just 3 days before that, on February 27th, the BBC also reported that China had purged 19 officials, including 9 who served in the People's Liberation Army, as she sought to consolidate even more power. After what's happened in Iran, she might be looking at these moves as colossal mistakes. Experienced officials have been removed, likely to be replaced by loyalists who will simply do exactly what she tells them. That's fine for Xi while he's alive and in power. But what happens when he's gone due to the U.S. sending a bomb right into one of his bunkers? China's entire military and political structure could collapse, just as we're now seeing in Iran. Still, China does have one thing going for it. Like Iran, China possesses a missile-based strategy that it intends to use to fend off the U.S. And there's no denying that China is significantly stronger in this department than Iran, having built massive missile stockpiles in preparation for its Taiwan invasion, as well as for self-defense. We mentioned China's ballistic missile stockpiles earlier. Iran itself had enormous stockpiles, with some in Israel believing the country was on track to amass 8,000 ballistic missiles by 2027, prior to the U.S. and Israeli strikes. Taking out command and control centers has drastically reduced Iran's ability to launch, but it hasn't eliminated that ability entirely. She will be relying on that fact to bolster his own missile-based strategy. However, China will also need to heavily defend its launch sites, as the U.S. has shown a clear tendency to strike these facilities. For Xi's ambition of invading Taiwan, this presents a very significant problem. That means those Chinese ballistic missile sites will need surface-to-air protection, McBTH explains, adding, that means fewer units can be deployed to Taiwan to actually cover the invasion. It also means that these ballistic missile units become far less mobile. China would find itself painted into a corner, much like Iran was on the surface-to-air missile front. It needs to keep its launchers constantly moving because every missile strike attempted emits a massive signature that can be used to target the launchers soon after. The problem this presents for China is that its launchers would spend more time on the move than actually firing, which means Xi's missile capacity is degraded without the U.S. even necessarily having to fire additional shots. Fear of immediate retaliation would mean that China's past plans of overwhelming an enemy with missile attacks would have to be shelved in favor of less frequent strikes and a whole lot of movement. Plus, China offers up a multitude of targets to the U.S. Beyond the 550 intercontinental ballistic missile launchers we mentioned, Business Insider reports the Pentagon believes China has 300 medium-range ballistic missile launchers at 150 launchers for ground-launched cruise missiles, 250 launchers for short-range ballistic missiles, and 300 for intermediate-range ballistic missiles. And you arrive at a staggering total of 1,550 ballistic missile launchers. That amounts to an enormous number of targets for the U.S. to hit. For China, having so many launchers does mean it will be able to sustain a missile-focused strategy longer than Iran. However, that strategy would be constantly degraded, as the U.S. has shown that it prefers to strike the archer rather than the arrows. In other words, and we said the same about command and control centers, missiles don't mean much when you don't have the launchers needed to send them flying. Add everything we've covered up to now and you're left with a whole host of military challenges that now stare Xi directly in the face as he observes what the U.S. is doing in Iran. China's president knows that making any moves that lead to U.S. involvement would result in his country facing the same shock and awe type of strategy. And though China is in a much stronger position to absorb the brunt of this strategy than Iran, there's another element that will have Xi shaking in his boots. Iran has inadvertently shown Xi that the U.S.'s power-based approach to building global geopolitical influence has truly worked. In response to the U.S. strikes on its territory, Iran has been attacking U.S. bases and military-adjacent targets in the Gulf region. On March 8th, CNBC noted that Bahrain, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and several other states that Iran classifies as allies of the U.S. have been attacked with drones and missiles. This is a profound miscalculation by Iran. It's attempting to bully these states as its entire military infrastructure crumbles. And this approach could very well end up solidifying U.S. allegiances in the Gulf region rather than destroying them. Iran is in effect turning itself into a geopolitical martyr by trying to hurt the U.S. through attacks on other countries. She knows that China would find itself in a very similar isolated position if it went to war with the U.S. As Mac Beath explains, within a few days of this conflict, more allies are starting to realize that Iran is an existential threat to the Middle East, and China should take notice of that. He points out that the U.S. military has bases in South Korea and Japan, along with rotational bases in Australia and the Philippines. She would undoubtedly have to strike these bases in an attempt to weaken any U.S. attack should war ever come. But all that would achieve is dragging those four powerful nations directly into the fight, presenting China with an even more insurmountable problem. Imagine all of this unfolding as a result of Xi following through on his plan to invade Taiwan. What should be an invasion of a relatively small island nation would quickly escalate into China fighting Taiwan and the U.S. And in attempting to battle back against the U.S., China would only invite more powerful nations into the war, all of whom would vehemently oppose it. As for allies, Russia is thousands of miles away and may well remember that China hasn't directly supported it in its Ukraine invasion. Iran is already being rendered a non-factor, and China's approach of building geopolitical influence through investment simply won't be enough to convince small countries to get involved in such a massive fight. What we see here are two fundamentally divergent geopolitical strategies at play. The U.S. is focused on might as evidenced by the hundreds of military bases built around the world. According to Al Jazeera, the U.S. maintains around 750 bases spread across 80 countries. China, on the other hand, has only one publicly acknowledged military base outside of its own territory in Djibouti, which serves more as a logistics hub than anything else. China has instead focused on pouring billions of dollars into helping smaller nations develop. While this is a fine, very long-term plan, it's not going to do much for China in 2027 if it does choose to invade Taiwan and the U.S. gets involved. What China has left itself with is a situation where it gets pinned into its own territory by a country that has bases in many major nations that surround China. And just like we see with Iran, those bases would inevitably become targets for China, which would only inflame geopolitical tensions further, resulting in a war that spirals wildly out of Xi's control. Perhaps the diplomat puts it best, as it stated on March 7th. Having tracked China's regional partnerships over the last decade, we have found that Beijing's influence consistently peaks at signing ceremonies and fades when security risks arise. Beijing has built a Middle East strategy centered on influence without military presence, the outlet reports. We're witnessing that stark reality right now in Iran, as China isn't rushing to do much of anything to help what is supposed to be one of its more powerful allies. What message does that send to the many countries that are militarily much smaller than Iran about what China would do for them if they were drawn into a war with the U.S.? It doesn't send a great message, and it means that China's money-based strategy of influence pales in comparison to what the U.S. offers its allies. Security and power are everything in a wartime scenario. China offers neither to its many partners and allies, and Xi knows it. What's happening in Iran has proven it. China's inaction speaks louder than any of the money it distributes. Sooner or later, Mac Beath says China will be forced to strike a non-aligned nation in a war with the U.S., just as Iran has been. And when that happens, she will wake up to the undeniable fact that the U.S. has allies that will fight. As for China, not so much. With nobody on his side outside of his own country, Xi is watching Iran and seeing the ghost of wartime future if he picks a fight with the U.S. An invasion of Taiwan would amount to precisely that. And the brutal wake-up call that Iran has delivered to China over little more than a week may just force Xi to completely reconsider everything he's been planning for years. Xi knows that the U.S. has a strategy that works. He also knows that the U.S. has a plan to crush China, as we reveal in our other video. Check it out if you want to learn more. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you're subscribed to Brief Update as we dissect war scenarios like this one every single week. And thank you, as always, for watching.